everyone to this edition of the Friends of Beaubears Island Speaker Series. My name is Rachael Bell, and I've been a part of the Friends of Beaubears Island for about 13 years now. The Friends of Beaubears Island operate on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq people in Miramichi, New Brunswick, along the banks of the Miramichi River. And this territory is covered by the Peace and Friendship Treaties, which the Mi'kmaq signed with the British Crown throughout the 1700s. And those treaties were upheld by the Canadian Constitution in 1982. And so those treaties are a big part of our life here in New Brunswick. And I hope that we can get into talking about what those treaties and other treaties mean to some of us here on this panel today. So I would like to throw the mic, as it were, to Katelyn. Do you want to get started?
Yeah. Hello, my name is Katelyn Copage, and I'm an all new band member from Sepegnegidig First Nation in Nova Scotia, otherwise known as Indian Brook or Shubi. But for the past 3 years, I've been living in unceded Wolastoqey territories in Fredericton. I am the Indigenous Experiential Education Coordinator at the University of New Brunswick.
Shira, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I am Shira Lurie, and I am a political historian of the United States at the University of Toronto. My official title is University College Fellow in Early American History. And I live and work in the Dish with One Spoon territory.
Thank you. Logan?
Hi, I'm Logan Keoughan. I'm a settler of Canadian Irish descent, currently living in Miramichi on unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory, and I work at the University of New Brunswick on unceded, unsurrendered Wolastoqey territory for the Faculty of Forestry and Environmental Management's Mackey working group, which was formerly the Truth and Reconciliation working group.
Thank you. And like I said, I'm Rachael Bell. I am a middle school teacher as well as the First Nations education lead for Anglophone School District North. I'm kind of juggling those two roles right now. And I also am a settler who lives and works in Miramichi on unceded Mi'kmaq territory. So I'm really grateful that these folks have joined me today to talk about our roles as young people working in education. I think we've all become part of structures that we grew up in, and now we're working within those structures. And we've all come to realize our roles as treaty people, and we're all kind of working through that role and what it means to be of this generation at this time on the land that we're on. So I guess I'd like to start. I'd like to know when you became aware of treaty, or when you became aware of your role as a treaty person, because I know for me, it was late in life that I became aware of this. Katelyn, would you like to start?
Sure. So like I just said, I'm originally from Sepegnegidig, which is in Nova Scotia, which is part of Mi'kmaq, which is Mi'kmaq ancestral homeland. So growing up, I grew up on my homeland, and I knew what treaty was. It wasn't necessarily talked about in that language, but my community is the closest community to the Shubenacadie residential school. So when you grow up with like such a devastating part of colonial history, there's no separation from the understanding of treaty. That was something that was just always talked about. Like, I don't remember the first time that I was told or became aware of treaties or treaty response, like my own personal treaty responsibility. But I didn't really consider what that meant or looked like for me personally until later in life, until I moved here and I realized that I was a guest on somebody else's territory when I moved to Wolastoqey homelands and started to and realized that I was a guest. I wasn't on my homelands anymore, and had to reevaluate what that meant to me.
What did that feel like? Could you talk more about that experience of kind of leaving your own territory and moving to someone else's?
It was rough. I think moving away from home was rough for me for a couple of different reasons. And I hope that I answer your question, but I think I'm going to do a roundabout way of getting there. But it took me, I felt really lonely when I first moved away from my territory, even though there were lots of other Indigenous people around me, lots of other Mi'kmaq people around me, but I still felt really lonely and disconnected from my land. And it took a lot of self-reflection and being out on the land and trying to understand my responsibilities to the physical land itself in order to understand what my new responsibilities as a treaty person are on this territory.
That's really beautiful. I knew it would be. Thank you. Shira, how about you?
Yeah, it's a tough question for me because I wouldn't say there was like a moment, when I became aware. I would characterize maybe for me personally, like the last maybe 8 to 10 years, maybe less, of like a growing awareness, I would say. I think, the first time I even heard someone self-identify as a settler was maybe like 6 years ago. I think the first time I heard a land acknowledgement was maybe 5 years ago. So I think, yeah, for me, it's really been a recent journey. And so, yeah, I wouldn't even say I am fully aware yet of what it means. I think I'm on still a journey of discovery, I would say.
Do you think, when I think about you, and I know like your family immigrated here not long before you were born, do you think that your experience as kind of a more recent settler, do you think that impacts how you feel about it, or what it took for you to kind of grapple with it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, like, generally thinking of sort of my family and community, we're sort of, diasporic people. So even the country that my family emigrated from, other ancestors had immigrated recently there, you know what I mean? So we don't really have like a strong connection to sort of land in place, so much as we have a strong connection to tradition and sort of like the stories of our people and that type of thing. So I think sort of understanding the importance of land and how it's linked to things like community and tradition has been sort of a new way of thinking for me, for sure.
Thank you for sharing. Logan.
Yeah, I guess when I feel that I really became aware of treaty, and that I was a treaty person, and that there are treaty responsibilities, and that this is something that really we should all be paying attention to, was when I was lucky enough to attend a blanket exercise put on by Cecilia Brooks in a class at UNB when I was doing my master's. So again, much later in life, only maybe 4 years ago now. And it was a really kind of shocking, emotionally devastating kind of revelation at the time, especially after growing up in Miramichi. Rachel, I'm sure you've felt this as well. It's very predominantly people view the Mi'kmaq people here and Indigenous people in a stereotypical way, and what we were exposed to growing up and in schools was very much those tropes and really horrible things that you don't really analyze when you don't have the chance when you're growing up. And the blanket exercise really makes you confront those things in a powerful way. Like I feel lucky that I was able to be exposed to that, and I'm still learning what it means for me to be a treaty person. And I think part of why these conversations are so important is, as a whole kind of settler and non-Indigenous people, we really still don't have a great grasp of what our treaty responsibilities are, because we haven't had this information's been withheld from us, and this knowledge has been withheld from us for a long time. And so, you know, our first work and things we need to do is to figure out how to be allies. So our, you know, the other side of the treaty, the Indigenous people who haven't had their treaty rights met, they can be raised up before we figure out what it is we're supposed to be doing.
That's a really beautiful way to put it. Because yeah, there is a lot of work and a lot of uncovering work to do, right? Of what these treaties are and how they've always existed, or they've existed for a long time, but they've been withheld, and that's very purposeful. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, I share a lot of Logan's experience. We grew up in the same town and we went to the same schools, so I definitely identify with what you're saying. I think looking back, it's really jarring because the city of Miramichi is surrounded by 3 Mi'kmaq communities really closely, and then there are a handful of Mi'kmaq communities not too far away from that. And the first time I went to a powwow, I had traveled to Ontario to a conference in grade 12. And I'd been surrounded by this culture without even knowing it, but I had to travel so far away to really encounter it for the first time. And you know, we went to school with Mi'kmaq people, and they were still kind of far away from us in a lot of ways. But I don't think it was until I was 26 doing my Bachelor of Education, and we had a blanket exercise, and we had a First Nations education course, and we started to go to community events and go to powwows and go to Treaty Day events and things like that, that I really started to understand that there is a whole piece of history and a whole piece of our community and our culture in this area that I had never seen and that had been withheld from me. And so in that same year, in 2016, I gave a talk about treaty in the same series. And I felt really uncomfortable because I was like, I'm this white lady who just found out that treaty is even a thing and that I'm even supposed to be a part of this relationship. And I'm going to go stand up in front of a room of people and talk about this. But I'd been really challenged that year by some of my professors. You know, we talked a lot in our Bachelor of Education about, okay, this hasn't been taught in schools. We don't know about treaty. We don't know about residential schools. We don't know about the cultures that were here first. And teachers in Canada are predominantly settlers. And if we don't start talking about it, this is not going to get out there. And there's so much fear about doing it wrong. And that same feeling that I had when I got up in front of that room of like, this is not what I'm supposed to be talking about. I'm not the one who's supposed to be talking about this, but if not me, who? Because no one else is doing it. And I got up in front of that room and everyone seemed to know what I was talking about already. All of these middle-aged white people who were part of my community and part of groups that I had been in, they all knew this stuff, but none of them had ever told me about it. And none of them were having those conversations. And it was scary, but it was also really affirming that, okay, if we're going to learn about this and still keep it hidden, then we're not really doing the work. We need to have these conversations, and like Logan said, start to understand what treaty means and get other voices heard so that we can all understand our responsibility together. I feel like that was a lot. So I think it's interesting because we've all kind of touched on how this wasn't something we kind of heard about or knew about throughout our childhoods or throughout our education. And I think for some of us, if not all of us, it was in university or in other educational settings that we kind of started to learn more about our treaty relationships. So I find that's an interesting tension, that schools on the one hand kind of hide this knowledge from us, but they have also helped us get to some of this knowledge. And now we all find ourselves working within those systems. So there's lots of tension within that. So Katelyn, would you like to talk about that for you?
Ooh, yeah, there's definitely a lot of tension there. So for me personally, too, in my role, I'm an experiential education coordinator, which experiential education has been around for a long time for Indigenous peoples, and it's just kind of like newly coming back into academics. But I still don't really understand how UNB as an institution, how that understands Indigenous experiential education, while also not being willing to do the work on their own part to understand what it means for them as a colonial institution to exist upon unceded Wolastoqey territory, and even fully acknowledging the truth of the harm that education has played in the continued erasure of Indigenous peoples and our relationship with treaty and non-Indigenous relationship with treaty. I think it's this is a biased opinion because I work in a university, but it does seem to be the case that a lot of students still, even just in 2020 with the new students we had come in, there's still students that come in, and we didn't do blanket exercises this year because we couldn't be in person, but still having the similar conversations, we're still hearing the same responses, that students aren't learning this until they come into university, or they're hearing about it talked, but they're not getting to have those intimate conversations and really trying to flesh out what that means for them, because it's something different for every person, whether you're Indigenous or a non-Indigenous person. Your treaty responsibility is yours, and it's a collective responsibility that we all share, but it is yours and yours alone. There's a little like mind-blowing moment that I want to say too. I don't know if it's going to be appropriate. Don't know if that's the story of my life. I don't know if it's going to be appropriate, but I'm going to say it anyway.
I know this about you, and I wanted you here for a reason.
A few years ago, Anne Sherman, who was the dean of the education department, she brought an Anishinaabe comedian and intellect, Ryan McMahon, to speak at the education department, and he was phenomenal. And one of the things that really hit home for me was, he said, if you're an Indigenous person and you're saying we are all treaty people, stop saying that. And I was like, oh my gosh, no, why? That is like what I've been literally telling every single person since I've started at UNB, like, we're all treaty people, get on board. And this like intellect is telling me to stop saying that. And it's like sitting on the edge of my seat, like, Ryan, tell me more. Why? What am I doing wrong? And his perspective was that using the phrase, we're all treaty people, disproportionately places the responsibility of understanding your treaty relationship on Indigenous people, and that non-Indigenous people and settlers weren't doing the work to understand what that relationship meant for them. And that blew my mind. And I think, yeah, I think that's a conversation that is needed to be had more province-wide.
Yeah, I find that really hits to a point that I feel strongly about it, and I have a lot of tension about, because throughout, last spring and the past year, there have been a lot of conversations about race and about the roles of whiteness and the roles of settlers in the status quo and in the state of things. And something that I find there's a lot of tension with is we need to listen to Indigenous voices, and we need to listen to people of color, and we need to listen to these voices that haven't been heard. But we also don't want to put more work on these communities who are doing so much work just to survive. And so listening to, I think it was a conversation between Resmaa Menakem and the author of White Fragility. I can't think of her name. And he was saying, no, white people need to do this work on their own. There need to be rooms full of settlers or full of white people figuring out their own white supremacy and figuring out their own settler roles. And you could kind of feel, it was a conversation in front of an audience, you could feel the tension of like, no, haven't there been enough rooms full of white people who have caused a lot of harm? And there's a real tension there, because I think you're right. I think it's really easy for us to say, well, they just need to tell us, Indigenous people need to tell us, like, what are we supposed to do? But I think that hits it, is like, we have to do this work. We have to see what our role is, and we have to see where we're complicit and what we could be doing better. And so I think it's going to be a tricky balance, but I think there's not been enough emphasis placed on that idea that, like, no, white people need to get in a room together and see where they're guilty and see where they're complicit and see where they're benefiting at the expense of other people and at the expense of treaty. But it's tricky.
It's tricky, and it's going to be uncomfortable, and it should be. Like, we have these uncomfortable feelings because it's our body's like visceral reaction to things that we're hearing and learning. There's no shame in it being uncomfortable and difficult, but that definitely doesn't erase the accountability or the responsibility for having those conversations.
Yeah, that's Resmaa Menakem's book is called My Grandmother's Hands, and it's about the embodiment of white supremacy. I'm so excited to dig into it more, but I think that's the whole thing, is like, you have to feel that discomfort in order to work through it. Stretch it out or something.
Soak in it.
Shira, you want to take it up?
I will try. I really appreciated both of your contributions, and I will say something I tell myself and sometimes tell my students is, like, being uncomfortable is the first step, right? It's not the step that tells you then turn away. It's the step that tells you, like, now we're moving into a place of, like, learning and growing, hopefully.
Yeah.
I do experience a lot of tension, like, personally, and I think, like, interpersonally in academia, and, like, specifically in my classroom. I find My students are very comfortable thinking and talking about things like settler colonialism. They're comfortable talking about decolonization. They're comfortable sort of, I don't want to say in the abstract because we do talk about sort of real examples, but it's sort of within sort of an academic discourse, they're very comfortable sort of grappling with this. It's when we start talking about like what it means for us, like personally and in the world and what they're doing next and all of that, where there is sort of tension and not even like a reticence, but a sort of like not knowing, and that is where the discomfort sort of tends to come in, I think. Another place I found tension, which might just be specific to my circumstance, is I teach American history in Canada. And so the sort of geographic disconnect between like the land and the people and the history we're talking about, I find can often be sort of a barrier to kind of grappling with some of this as well.
I think, I don't know if this is related to what you're talking about, but I just find we are really disconnected from the land. That's a tension I feel in my classroom every day. It's like my kids are in this concrete bubble all day, every day. And like, how do I help them understand their relationship to the land when we're standing on these floors all the time?
Yeah.
And I imagine in a university, and especially in the online university that now exists, it's even harder to really connect with like having your feet on dirt.
Mm-hmm. And also sometimes I'm talking about a place to someone who has never been there before and never, been anywhere near there before. So yeah, sometimes I find that a challenge.
That makes sense. Logan?
Yeah, I'm sure I can relate somewhat with Katelyn working at the university and kind of this feeling of working in a colonial institution that isn't really ready to fully confront its colonialism and the effect it's had, and that's not something that can happen overnight. Listening to you talk about like uncomfortable and kind of white people having to deal with white people on this issue, I think it's so important, and I see it a lot at the university level, that the Indigenous people working at the university are bombarded with anything to do with reconciliation, decolonization, whatever. It's always going to these people who are getting burnt out, and it's because, in my opinion, a lot of the times the white people there aren't willing to do the internal work to be uncomfortable first. They want to ask and get that help, even when some of those roles are meant to be helping, but not constantly in that way. Yeah, I feel a lot of tension, and like daily for me, the understanding that I work in a colonial institution. I'm the person who is, I'm in the demographic most benefiting from the system that we live in today as a white man. And honestly, a lot of times I question, my role as it stands. Should I be a white man working in a position that's dealing with, decolonization, or should I be giving this role up to an Indigenous person? And that's kind of a struggle that I don't have an answer for, obviously, and it's something hard for me to deal with, but I deal with it by being one of the white people always talking to other white people, like trying to be a voice to have those conversations. There's a really great book that I read recently called Unsettled Expectations by Mackey, I think. And it's really about that, about white people and settlers in Canada and the US. She's dealing specifically with two instances where in one, essentially a new reserve is proposed for a nation that previously had no reserve lands and has successfully won that they are owed them. And the government decides that pieces of land can be put up for sale. Essentially, this nation will be given money to be able to buy pieces of land that they can then create a reserve on. And they're, of course, met with like ferocious opposition, racist and, I don't know, not quite so horrible to land that white people see as their own, going to a reserve, and how difficult it is for us to comprehend what the way that we've been thinking about the world is not necessarily the way that it should work, and that just because someone, it's hard for me to explain. I feel I'm rambling a little bit, but one of the examples is, a white farmer saying like, well, my family has worked this land for hundreds of years, and how that's really a European colonial mindset that for some reason, fencing off your land and working it to make it better, that's all just colonial and used to justify taking away land from Indigenous people who didn't, necessarily use land in that way. It really talks a lot about that. I don't want to go on too much, but I think it's important that the treaty conversation is also centered on the land conversation, because that's what it's about. And the Indigenous people, the Wabanagi people that I'm lucky to know and have as mentors and friends, that's what they're asking for is land, the land that they were promised and owed, and that it's been settlers who haven't held up any of their end of the treaties. I think that's another kind of point that your conversation reminded me of, is in terms of, white people being in a room talking to white people. We're the ones who aren't holding up the treaty. We're the ones who are causing the issues. When you're seeing Black Lives Matter movements and stuff, those leaders are saying the same things. Like, racism is the white issue. It's our job to look at ourselves and find out what's going on before we can, engage in an actual meaningful conversation. And that's the most difficult part. And I think we're really still quite far away from that. There's a lot of really great things happening in reconciliation and decolonization work, but I don't think there's that many conversations between white people, between settlers, about our issue. And I think that we need that before we can make a next big jump.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a little bit of rambling, I think, but thanks
That's
for
okay.
listening.
No, I appreciate it a lot. It's not easy to talk about, and it's not conversations that we get to have a lot, so it's good to just let it out. I think so. Katelyn and Logan and I are all in territory covered by the Peace and Friendship Treaties, and at a really basic level, those treaties say that Europeans and First Nations people are going to live on this land, and they're going to coexist, and they're not going to change. They're not going to impact each other negatively, or they're not going to force one another to change the way that they're living their lives. That's how I understand the Peace and Friendship Treaties. And my students who are 11 look at those treaties, they're instantly like, we didn't do that. So we promised this, we're not doing that. And they recognize that the Mi'kmaq people, Mi'kma'ki covers what we now know as New Brunswick and PEI, Nova Scotia, and parts of Newfoundland. And now Mi'kmaq people are forced onto these small pieces of land that we call reserves. And the students understand that, and they're 11. And they say, well, if we weren't supposed to interfere with the Mi'kmaq way of life, how come we took their kids away to residential schools? And they understand that. They understand that they are the descendants of settlers, and these are the promises that were made and they were broken. So obviously I think there's a lot more there to dig into, but if fundamentally these 11-year-olds can understand that, like, we signed this paper, we upheld, like, it was upheld by the Canadian Constitution, but we didn't do that. That gives me a lot of hope. It's super exciting. But when you start to talk to them about, what can they do, that's when it gets harder, because I think we don't have those answers either. But I do agree with you, Logan, when I think about it, I think about the folks who are asking for their lands back, and it's important, I think, to continue having these conversations and hopefully getting closer to that as a reality. In my classroom, I find I have a lot of hope in, like, talking to 11-year-olds who just they're very black and white, and they're cut and dried. That's lovely. But in my role as First Nations education lead, I find it's a little bit trickier. I can feel really good about myself in thinking, like, okay, I'm going to help teachers get more comfortable talking about this with their students, because I think that does have an impact, and I hope that I can help teachers with that. But the mandate of what we're trying to do also is, I'm part of the 10-year education plan for New Brunswick, and part of our district improvement plan and our school improvement plans is to close the achievement gap for First Nations students. And that's where I feel a lot of tension, because I think it's a really colonial goal to say, okay, these are the standards that the world is setting. Indigenous students should be meeting them. And of course, I want everyone to be able to succeed within the world that we have. And I think that's super important. But I also think, is the work of decolonization not to change the goals or to change the standards? I don't know. That's the question that's been really on my mind, especially, I think, Shira, you brought up a few weeks ago, Tuck and Yang's article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And it's really easy for me to sit and think about, okay, we have to spread this idea, and we have to make it more possible to have these conversations within the education system. But how within education can we stop using decolonization as a metaphor and really look at land back, and how education can be a part of that work? And obviously it's something I'm still struggling with.
I think, like, from my perspective, in trying to have those conversations with colleagues, it's been, I want to say, like, disheartening and potentially alarming how unwilling some people are to have that conversation. Even as we talk so much about sort of reconciliation within the university, even as we're teaching about settler colonialism and decolonization, when I say, you know, have you read this article and have you thought about how we're using decolonization as a metaphor, and we're using teaching about decolonization as a way to make ourselves feel better as opposed to actually acting to decolonize. I, for one, have been sort of met with hesitation and sometimes like denial.
I think we've talked about a lot of like tensions, and I think that's important. Does anybody have any kind of hopeful moments or stories, or like what they feel like is a concrete next step that they're kind of working on or taking?
I'm still hopeful, is even though most of my day may be characterized as kind of just questioning everything. I'm hopeful about the future, especially when I talk with like students in our faculty, and we've created, you know, a student-specific subcommittee of the working group that I'm in, and we have Indigenous and non-Indigenous students in that group, and it's like a world of difference compared to speaking to faculty, for example, of how engaged and understanding they are of what's going on, and even some of the things that we're talking about, decolonization as a metaphor. Like there's, you know, 20-year-olds who get that right away, when I have to spend maybe 20 minutes trying to explain it to a faculty member, for example. And they're, you know, pushing me to look for the active ways that we can decolonize. And one of the ways we're trying to do that is by literally looking at all of our courses offered in the faculty, and with help from you know, Indigenous partners and people that I've built relationships with, to literally look at our curriculums and our courses one by one and see how we can decolonize them piece by piece. Where should Indigenous knowledge be braided in? How do we, in certain courses, look at making sure that we're not integrating Indigenous knowledge, that we're making sure things are presented equally. There's two different systems at play here, and having those types of conversations, like Rachel, when you talk about, you know, getting students like closing the achievement gap, it's kind of like saying, how do we get Indigenous students to do better in colonial schools?
Yeah, exactly.
But obviously you're not going to say it that way, but why is that on the table? You know, why can't we look at some of my, you know, more hopeful goals that have, you know, created always with guidance I'm so lucky to have from Wabanagi elders and people that I know, to be able to have Indigenous students in our faculty work with local community elders or knowledge holders, have that count for course credit. Like how can we give them the opportunity, even within our system, to work in Indigenous knowledge and traditional ways, and what will that look like? So yeah, I'm still really hopeful. You know, we still have students who are in their third and fourth years of undergrads who are just learning about treaty in residential schools every year. But you know, that's changing a little bit. Fewer students and more students looking to engage with the types of things that we're doing, and you know, for the most part, pushing us to move much faster than what all the old white people are wanting to move at that pace. I don't know if you heard rushing dog feet there, but they've been set free.
Awesome. Anybody else want to pick up that thread?
I definitely want to pick up on that last little thread there about the achievement gap. I'm down for having that conversation when every single Indigenous person has access to secure housing and clean drinking water. Like there are human rights being violated on the regular, and we can't talk about success in a colonial institution if people's basic needs are not being met. And that's just like besides whether or not the colonial education system is like the appropriate and only way to educate people. But there needs to be clean drinking water first and foremost, I think. There are tons of tensions, and I'm really glad that we're like shifting away from the tensions, because like that's a conversation that I have internally every day, all day. So it's really nice. Thanks for shifting the conversation to things that are more hopeful. And similarly to Logan, the students that we engage with, the young people, like my students aren't 11, they're like 19 to 57, but this is still new to them. And as soon as they engage with the concepts of broken promises, like they get it. It's not an easy concept, or it's not a difficult concept to understand. And I think, I don't know. Okay, so I don't know how to transition to this so like effortlessly. So it's going to be a bit clumsy, but something that also gives me hope too is other staff and faculty members like Logan who are non-Indigenous and are doing a lot of the work alongside of us to have those conversations. So it takes the burden just a little bit more off of our shoulders. Those conversations are exhausting, and they're like he spoke earlier just about the burdensomeness of the tediousness of the requests. Like my job has nothing to do with language, but the amount of times I've been emailed and asked to translate something is been numerous. So it's really encouraging to know that there are good people that are also on our side and helping us have these conversations. So it's not just Indigenous people. Yeah.
Thank you.
Something that gives me hope is just thinking about, all this stuff about achievement gaps and ways of knowing and how we measure all of that. I think actually I'm seeing sort of a silver lining in the pandemic in terms of the ways that institutions, especially universities, are adapting quickly to changes that many people had been sort of advocating for many, many years, that now all of a sudden, because there's a pandemic and things are virtual, that those changes are able to be made in terms of accessibility, in terms of like accepting different kinds of resources and projects, and sort of how people show their knowledge and understanding. At least for me, that's sort of, something that's been a frustration for years and years and years in academia, that now all of a sudden, all these changes are being accepted instantly. And so I'm hopeful moving forward that many of us have learned that sort of the ways that felt, or the things that seemed sort of in concrete, and this is how we do things, and this is how we think about academia, are not in concrete, and maybe there's something to be learned from this moment of flexibility that can change academia for the better.
That is really exciting. I hope it's something that sticks. Yeah. I'm so grateful to each of you for joining me on this panel, and just listening to each of you talk about these hopeful things gives me so much hope. But also knowing that we're the people, we have some power now, and that's crazy to me. But we are in positions right now where we are in rooms where we can raise our voices and bring up topics that maybe weren't being talked about before. And so just knowing that there's a generation of folks like us and hopefully on our side that are bringing up these ideas and that are pushing back and are writing curricula and are in faculty meetings and are being heard, that gives me so much hope. I'm so excited about that. And knowing, like you all said, that this younger generation is coming up with more awareness and with more curiosity and more willingness to speak about it. And that gives me a lot of hope too. Thank you so much. You've all been so generous and so candid and so vulnerable. And these are not easy conversations to have. So I really appreciate everything that you've given. Well,